Thanks for coming to City Forum. So I'm Alex Carner, Associate Professor of for City Forum this year. As I did the last City Forum, I'm going to offer a land acknowledgement again, taking inspiration from Emmy Aguilar, our first speaker this year. And the land acknowledgement that I'm going to offer resists Indigenous erasure and supports Indigenous people in their ongoing struggles. So over time, Indigenous people residing in Central Texas have faced disease, war, genocide, and forced relocation, yet they continue to exist and to live on their homelands. These folks include the Alabama Coshada, the Caddo, the Carrizo Comecrudo, the Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, as well as other American Indian and Indigenous peoples and communities. If you're interested in learning more about Indigenous presence and ongoing activities in and around Austin, you can search for the Austin Powwow and the Indigenous Cultures Institute. Native-land.ca is also a great resource when seeking to learn about the Indigenous people and communities who were the original inhabitants of a place. At UT, there's actually an ongoing struggle right now aimed at returning the remains of 3 Indigenous ancestors who are currently housed at the Texas Archaeological Research Lab that's on the Pickle campus. If you search for UT Return the Remains and head over to the Indigenous Cultures Institute link, you can sign an open letter to President Hartzell asking him to end the delay in the return and take immediate action to return the ancestors to the Miacan Garza band of Coahuiltecans. So with that said, I want to introduce our speaker today. So we're lucky to have Jovanna Rosen visiting us. She's an assistant professor of public policy at Rutgers University-Camden. Her research contributes to contemporary urban planning and geographical debates at the intersection of urban growth, urban inequality, and community development. And today she'll be presenting a talk about her new book that was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press called Community Benefits, Developers, Negotiations, and Accountability. So let's welcome Jovanna to City Forum.
Can you hear me? Everything? Okay, good. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here, to Alex and Miriam. Miriam and I went to undergrad together, so I'm very excited to see her engage in this capacity. It's really fun. And this is the first time talking about my book after it's been published, so a little nervous. Might rely on my notes a little bit more than usual. And there are also amazing fonts here, but you guys are architecture people, so vision with me. My book is titled Community Benefits, Developers, Negotiations, and Accountability. And it really looks at the community benefits movement as a community development strategy. What do these agreements involve? What do they produce for communities? And what are the factors that contribute to success? A very important question for students who become practitioners, right? And for us as academics. And so the title is going to give you a sense of where I'm headed in this talk. These agreements need mechanisms for accountability to ensure that even after the agreement gets signed, they deliver on their community promises. And throughout, I'm going to show you that even after the agreement gets signed, even after communities get that policy win, that's really not even close to the end of the story. And then I also want to acknowledge that this work was funded by the Bedrosian Center at USC, the Labor Research and Action Network, and the Haynes Foundation. So thank you to them for funding my work. So what are community benefits, and why do they matter to urban development and community development? Beginning in the early 2000s, we really saw a shift in urban development. Local communities began to insert themselves in a really important way into development negotiations as a strategy to build community influence, to directly shape how development happens, and ideally to build community control over local development. Communities and/or labor unions, often working together, began negotiating directly with developers and project advocates to dedicate benefits to local residents. And the first negotiated agreements were seen as major wins by local organizers toward their goal of community control over development. For community advocates, the goal here is really to promote regional equity. These are often regional projects, light rail lines, mega projects, new stadiums that bring these dispersed regional benefits, but concentrated harm to the communities in which they take place because of their high local impact. And so community advocates use these agreements to explicitly achieve 2 goals. One, to change how development processes occur towards more equitable and inclusive processes from the very beginning of the process. And secondly, to create better outcomes, more equitable distributions of the costs and benefits of urban development projects. And here I'm really talking about 2 different types. Let's try this. it worked. Project labor agreements, which are between developers and unions, and community benefits agreements, which are between developers and communities. So community benefits agreements are agreements between developers and the community. Often community participation takes the form of coalitions, organizations, resident participation. And developers gain support for the project, so residents agree to support the project in exchange for local benefits, and these have ranged widely: jobs, parks, grants, that sort of thing. The first significant CBA occurred around the Staples Center project in downtown LA, a really massive development that revitalized, brought a lot of investment into downtown. But since then, they've become common throughout the country around large stadium projects, transportation, mixed-use development, and so on. There's a lot of research on community benefits agreements, but the vast majority is focused on how do we get agreements? What does that process of participation look like? Agreement formulation. And there's very little on what these agreements produce and how implementation happens. PLAs are contracts between developers and unions. So unions agree not to strike and to provide access to a skilled workforce, which becomes really important on like light rail projects. And in exchange, unions get direct access to some of the jobs produced, and all of the jobs are raised to union labor standards, which makes union bidders more competitive. And project labor agreements have existed for about a century. There was a project labor agreement around the Hoover Dam. But since the early 2000s, so a very similar time frame, we start seeing them being used for community development purposes through what are called community workforce provisions. Targeted hire, for example, to local residents and veterans, and a real shift. And since then, the vast majority of PLAs include at least one community workforce provision. So this is now the dominant agreement type. But most of the agreement here, most of the research here has really focused around legal issues around the agreements. They're highly controversial, I'll talk about that in a second, and have been really contested in the courts. But there's a really important and underexplored connection to community development and planning, and real outstanding questions about what these agreements deliver and for whom. So why do these agreements matter? Well, they matter for both urban development and community development. So for urban development, the scale here is quite significant. We're talking about large-scale urban development projects, often mega projects, such as my LA case study, a photo featured here, which is concerning a $2.1 billion light rail line that was supposed to, anticipated to create $32 million in local economic spillovers. And the broader policy applies to tens of billions of dollars in funding. These projects often involve public infrastructure or large public subsidies, so there's a really important question of what is public money delivering and for whom? But they're also important because they become really common on large-scale projects because they're really effective at expediting development. And so what is the development process producing and for whom? And due to the way that they alter project construction and the development process, they become highly politicized. The past 4 presidents issued executive orders on the use of PLAs on federal projects. So obviously, Presidents Bush and Trump restricted their use. Presidents Obama and Biden enabled their use. And this national attention, I mean, executive orders, right, like, is warranted because of the large amounts of monies at stake. We're also seeing efforts to systematize and mandate benefits through larger, broader public policies that move beyond ad hoc agreements, including successful or attempted agency-wide policies and city ordinances in places like Seattle, Detroit, LA, and beyond. And so practitioners are moving forward with this strategy and encouraging local benefits distributions at scale. But we really need to understand what these agreements are producing and for whom. But beyond the big money and politics, these agreements matter because the projects deeply impact communities. And residents who have not only had to endure impacts from construction, but often face significant neighborhood change, gentrification, and threats of displacement from new development. These projects enter into these neighborhood stories. So this is a photo from my LA case study. If you're familiar with the Crenshaw, is anyone from LA? No, okay, oh, super bummer. See, this is the font that I was hoping for throughout. It's pretty, right? So this is from the Crenshaw neighborhood of Los Angeles. So often considered the heart of Black Los Angeles, a historically predominantly Black, low-income neighborhood in this very close to the downtown, which is now one of the hottest real estate markets in the nation. The regional transportation provider, LA Metro, was building just recently completed $2.1 billion light rail line through the community, but that's also bringing these good local jobs that could create career opportunities in an industry that's historically excluded Black workers. And so one of my LA informants described the community's motivation in fighting for benefits, and this person said, "I live 2 blocks from the project. My community is messed up every day." And this was true for over a decade. The least I can hope for is that my neighbor can get a job from this project. So these agreements are used to ensure that the affected community is compensated to make these regionally impactful and beneficial projects good for them as well, to offset this concentrated harm, and this is why people are coming to the negotiating table. And then beyond these immediate events, it's really important as planners especially to recognize that these projects enter into a broader ongoing history of historical inequalities and cumulative effects of decades of investment and disinvestment in underserved communities, including major planning failures during and after urban renewal. And so with more investment in urban cores, these agreements were envisioned by organizers to avoid these past mistakes, a way to do development differently by including residents in the development process and the benefits produced, and directly include people as beneficiaries. So great, right? Here's the challenge, is that outcomes appear to vary really dramatically. Some agreements are delivering what they promise to communities and maybe improving equity in the urban development process. However, others are not, and maybe just greasing the wheels of development, making it easier to do these large mega projects that can create such concentrated harm. And in that case, they could render participation token. And yet these agreements are becoming increasingly common as many developers see this as the tool that unlocks development and to get people on board with these large regional projects that many people want, but no one wants near them. And community advocates hoping that this could be a key to creating at least some community control over development. So it takes a long time to observe outcomes. We all know it takes a long time to build. And so even though these agreements have been around for now roughly 2 decades, we're just now starting to see what is actually happening in communities, what are these agreements producing over the long term. And it's also very difficult to observe ad hoc agreements at scale. So we know very little about these agreements systematically deliver the patterns of inequality or equity created. And we need to understand what these agreements produce and for whom. And so that's the contribution that my book makes. What do these projects deliver for whom, and what are the factors that contribute to success? So what should we expect in this process? Outcomes for whom? So for project owners, they're looking at less conflict with the community and labor to reduce the risk and avoid project delays. Local government stakeholders are looking to gain benefits for their constituents, but also to enable development to happen in their jurisdictions. Unions want jobs for their members and to make union bidders more competitive, which leads to more jobs and gives them a greater market share. And for the community, the delivery of community benefits, not just promises, but the material delivery. And this is really the connection to community development through benefits that advance people or place-based strategies within a spatially bound community to foster physical improvements, economic opportunity, human capital with economic spillovers, and wealth creation. But for community development to happen, they need to get what's promised when the agreement is signed. And so the question really remains, what gets delivered? And so I thought one of my Atlanta-based community activists really explained the situation from the community's perspective, the challenge of benefits delivery. And this person said, well, anybody can put something on paper. The integrity is getting off the paper into a reality. The integrity is for the people to benefit, that the agreement was designed to benefit. And this is a theme I'm going to return to throughout, the idea of paper benefits, the promises made in the agreement, versus the tangible benefits, including good jobs, that residents depend upon to realize actual gain from these agreements. Paper benefits are just promises. They don't pay your bills. They don't provide resources, and in the face of these large projects, they don't provide communities protection against gentrification and displacement, stability, and improvement. And this quote illustrates the community's concern, which I saw repeatedly throughout this work, that at the outset, there's a real risk and a real fear that agreements won't deliver anything, that they won't result in the tangible benefits that motivated communities to fight for the agreement, which is the compensation that they were promised in the agreement to make this development worth their while. And so there's a lot at stake here, and evidence indicates that these agreements aren't just turnkey, and some are failing to give communities what they were promised. So today I'm going to focus on these questions, which are the contributions that I make to community development research, including what outcomes do agreements produce for communities, and what are the conditions under which community benefits get produced, what works. And the second question is a particularly important one because we can improve future agreements by understanding these factors. So in my book, I look at 4 case studies, 2 PLAs in LA and Seattle, and 2 CBAs in Atlanta and Milwaukee. And I use these cases to show the different challenges that agreements can face during implementation, which can undermine the material delivery of community benefits, the tangible, not the paper benefits. I dedicate a chapter to each and of these different patterns in the different cases. But next I want to dive into tell you 2 stories. Normally, as a social scientist, I'd pick the CBAs or the PLAs and show you how these cases are roughly comparable and talk about my case study design. But we're in Texas, and I want to give you, and I know that there are a lot of students in the room, so I kind of rearranged the talk in this way. PLAs are not legal on a lot of public projects because of state law. So I didn't want to pick just the PLAs. I think it's important to talk about CBAs and to give you a sense of what's possible. With that said, I also think it's really important, especially for students who are going to become practitioners, to understand what works and to give you guys a sense of those possibilities and what urban development can look like and the structure of success. And so the LA case study is really the most successful one, so I want to talk about that even though PLAs are within a challenging current legal context in Texas. It's fun. So today I'm going to move across these cases in a little bit of a different way. So I'm taking you to Atlanta and LA to look at 2 policies. The Atlanta case concerns the $1.4 billion new-ish now Atlanta Falcons stadium. It's now called the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Do we have football fans? Okay, all right. This is a big deal. And for the LA Metro project labor grant, I know we have transit fans in here. I'm focused on the first major project from the Metro PLA, which concerns a $2.1 billion light rail line called the Crenshaw LAX Transit Corridor Project. It opened last year, though it's not complete as an entire line. And here's the important point. Both agreements will be considered success by the developers and by many local government officials, and even by the passive observer. You could say that they both effectively delivered these paper benefits. The personal development lens, the policy around the Atlanta Stadium failed in many ways, while the LA case was fairly successful because it created some degree of accountability. My methods are qualitative. Interviews, archival research, including a lot of media content analysis, and for LA, action research with a community organization. And this enabled me to trace in depth how implementation unfolded around this ambitious historic project labor agreement. I'm happy to talk about this. There's an appendix in my book, but for right now, I want to tell you 2 stories. Good? We're still here? You guys are killing it. So the story of the Atlanta Falcons stadiums begins in the early 2010s when the Falcons owner, the billionaire founder of the Home Depot, his name is Arthur Blank, began pushing for a new stadium for the team. And he really wanted a retractable roof. So this is really, in many ways, the story of a retractable roof. Not joking. And at the time, the Falcons played at the Georgia Dome, which was located in the historically disinvested Atlanta West Side. Close to downtown, the birthplace of the civil rights movement, a really important legacy of organizing, but also a neighborhood that has struggled with disinvestment and institutional neglect for decades. And residents and the community experienced significant upheaval due to previous stadium projects specifically, including failures during the 1996 Olympics, that caused a lot of displacement and left a legacy of distrust of local institutions. The new stadium threatened more of the same, including it was to be built on the site of 2 historical Baptist churches where Spelman and Morehouse colleges were founded, and residents worried that gentrification was just on the horizon and that this would just contribute to more of the same. But the city was really worried that the Falcons would move to the suburbs. The Braves had just done, if you're a baseball fan, the Atlanta Braves and the Falcons threatened a similar move. So they really wanted to keep them downtown. City officials promised $200 million in hotel motel tax revenue, and the project moved forward. The community understood the political climate. They viewed the stadium as a done deal and saw their only real organizing strategy as an effort to try to use the stadium and the wealth it represented for local benefits. The city negotiated with Arthur Blank's foundation for $15 million, and the city also promised $15 million from the former redevelopment agency called Invest-Atlanta. And public officials, in a very important move, required that the $200 million in public bonds couldn't be issued until a community benefits policy was approved. And this was really important and created a key source of leverage for the community. A committee was formed with residents and public officials to negotiate the benefits package that the city council would review prior to issuing the bonds. The process became extremely tense. The community fought hard for a legally binding agreement, an enforceable agreement that you could sue if parties violated the contract terms. And this was because of the tense history around prior stadium deals. The residents held a honestly justifiable, deep-rooted mistrust of local institutions and worried that the stadium would extend this history of failed investment. The talks continued for months, and city officials and Falcons representatives began to be worried about the amount of time it was taking to deliberate. Since a decision needed to be made, again, because of this previous decision, before the bonds could be issued and a project could proceed. Community representatives, though, they knew that their leverage was these public bonds, and their ability to hold up these bonds was their key to getting a binding agreement and the benefits that they wanted out of this $30 million investment. But in the middle of one meeting in mid-November 2013, a city council member announced, in kind of a casual way, that the agreement had been moved already before the city council. So they moved forward with issuing the bonds, and the move eliminated the committee's leverage and ensured that the benefits package would be a non-binding plan and not a legally enforceable agreement. And for many, it confirmed their fears that the committee never had any real power. Community representatives were outraged. And roughly 50 residents started shouting shame during this meeting, their audio recordings. And one resident said, "You wonder why we want an agreement? Because we don't trust you. And you proved yourself untrustworthy tonight." And even the city council president expressed a lot of shock and concern about it, but the process moved forward regardless. So as a result, the committee's work yielded a non-binding plan that didn't specify individual projects. So it wasn't clear what this $30 million investment would go to. Just general priorities. And this created a grant-making process that left enormous discretion to the Blank Foundation for $15 million and Invest-Atlanta for the other $15 million. And again, Invest-Atlanta is the city. Some residents vowed to vigorously enforce the plan and moved to keep this committee active through implementation to ensure that benefits were delivered, to keep everyone at the table, and to fight for their projects. But they'd lost key leverage, and local government officials were clear that the committee would have no enforcement authority during implementation. So the process moved towards a request for proposals for grants by both Invest-Atlanta and the Blank Foundation, who chose projects to fund. And this, again, is the community development outcome. Where does the money go, right? This is what everyone fought for in the community. And it's important to recognize that the community did get some of their original goals, including this Lindsay Street Park, which is the first park in the English Avenue neighborhood, as well as a workforce center, the Quest Workforce Center, that they really fought for. However, other grants went to entities that the community questioned, including nonprofits outside the neighborhood. And in particular, there was a $1.2 million grant that went to the Atlanta Police Foundation for police cameras in the neighborhood. And when the community learned about this at this committee meeting, there was no representatives from the Blank Foundation or the city for them to ask questions about. Why did you do this? What can we do about this investment? And the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is like the big paper in Atlanta, ran an article about the meeting with a picture of the empty meeting, just a couple community residents, calling it the loneliest body in local government. And so the Blank Foundation and Invest-Atlanta implemented the agreement at their sole discretion using a philanthropic grant-making model, selecting the recipients loosely based on the non-binding plan as they saw fit and not really responsive to the community. City representatives argued that the community didn't have the capacity to direct this investment. And as a community development strategy, This approach created clear equity issues and participation and outcomes. Thinking about these original goals that I started with, about what these agreements are supposed to produce. And there were multiple instances when in implementation, the process departed from community goals and priorities. And altogether, this investment has left important questions about whether or not benefits and the stadium project will create lasting change for residents, or just more of the same, or potentially even amplifying the gentrification that's already begun to take place. And if you're interested in learning more about that context in Atlanta, I would direct you to Dan Immergluck's work. Meanwhile, however, Arthur Blank and the city got what they wanted. The stadium was built, the Falcons stayed downtown, the bonds were issued, and the team even keeps concessions and revenue from selling the naming rights, which they sold to Mercedes-Benz, of course, the luxury car manufacturer, for an undisclosed amount. So community activists worked to hold the Blank Foundation and the city at the table, to keep them focused on spending the allocated money according to community priorities. However, they had limited leverage, mostly threats to expose noncompliance in the media, and to therefore threaten the Blank Foundations and the city's reputations. The residents noted some examples where this strategy worked and attributed it all to this threat of endangering their public reputations. But I think it's really important that we think about this as an enforcement structure. This is a really reactive strategy, and it's a really weak strategy for ensuring that community benefits get delivered. It was the only option available to the community for organizing, but as a structure of an agreement for implementation, this is a poor way to hold the city and the Blank Foundation accountable, and the outcomes reflect this disconnect, and I call this a non-responsive philanthropic approach. So I want to spend a little more time on LA, and again, focusing on what works and how we can build accountability, because you've seen the challenges when we don't have accountability now. So I'm going to move from Atlanta to LA, a stadium project to a transportation project, to show you what accountability can look like. And while I argue that when viewed through the lens of community benefits and community development, the Atlanta policy failed in many ways, the LA agreement was the most successful of the ones that I looked at. And it's because it has produced some degree of accountability. Though I'm going to show you accountability and community benefits is a very fragile process. And it's a very contingent state. So the second story. This story really begins when LA County voters approved Measure R in 2008, which is a sales tax measure that dedicated $40 billion to regional transportation projects over 30 years. The early local economic estimates were significant. An estimated 210,000 construction jobs and $32 million in economic spillovers. And Metro emphasized this local impact, again, the pointer, in the way in which it marketed the agreement, right? So this is a very significant public investment using sales tax dollars approved through a ballot measure with a large expected local economic impact. Traditionally, these jobs have not been equally accessible across groups, since construction labor unions have historically excluded workers of color and women. Black workers and women are still significantly underrepresented, sometimes due to discrimination, but also due to the informal way in which hiring occurs in the construction industry. A process that's very informal and systematically excludes outsiders. And this exclusion matters. We often think of construction jobs as temporary jobs, but when you have access to union pathways and job training, these can be high-paying career opportunities with retirement benefits. And the local history here really shaped these events. There's a tense history between Metro and the urban poor in LA, and LA has a history of racial uprising, largely due to the systematic underinvestment by institutions such as Metro in communities of color, such as Crenshaw. In one example, in the 1990s, a local group called the Bus Riders Union sued Metro and won, demonstrating that Metro had discriminated against the urban poor by favoring light rail over bus transit, which is hard to do, and causing significant harm to low-income residents. It's hard to prove that in court, I mean. Community residents continue to point out Metro's disparate impact, including that Metro builds at grade or at street level in low-income communities, but builds at or above or below ground in wealthier communities. So it presents safety and traffic hazards in lower-income communities. Metro also initially proposed to not even build a station in the Crenshaw area, even though the project was always going to run through there. And yet, Measure R is continuing this history, building entirely new light rail lines, such as this $2 billion Crenshaw line, the first mega project under Measure R, which cuts through Crenshaw. And finally, as Measure R was being discussed, there was turnover on the Metro board, including a new supervisor at the time, Mark Ridley Thomas, a prominent Black community advocate who represented the Crenshaw area. So at this time, Metro leadership was changing towards a different role to change the culture within Metro for the benefit of these historically disinvested communities. And then Supervisor Ridley Thomas fought for the Crenshaw line and the Leimert Park station because he understood that the neighborhood needed to be connected to the regional transportation system, even as it threatened gentrification. And so the goal became, how do we make sure this prosperity is enjoyed by all? And also, you know, this is California, so ballot box measures, right? Metro's in an era where funding for future expansion efforts depends on community support of these ballot box measures. And Metro's kept coming back to the public for money. So obviously Measure R passed, $40 billion. 4 years later, they attempted Measure J, which failed. It would have extended Measure R. And the failure was due to organized community opposition, including the bus riders union. And so Metro realized that it depended on community support to achieve its organizational goals. It needs the community. And it's clear both from my interviews and Metro's public response that Metro sees the PLA and community benefits as a key way to demonstrate its public commitment and demonstrate its performance for low-income communities. And as a result of investment and with the promise of a future investment, construction firms saw this huge opportunity in the LA region. A ton of money, a ton of projects coming down the pipeline in LA. But securing these contracts means approval from the Metro Board of Directors, which means maintaining a good relationship with Metro. And that becomes central to the bottom line of these firms. And all of this has taken place within the LA context, where, as we discussed earlier, a huge history of regional equity organizing, a strong infrastructure of community organizations, and where the community benefits movement started. So these historical and contemporary factors set up this context where all the actors involved, from the community to the Metro to the contractors, depended on each other to achieve their goals. And this was the basis for the fragile accountability that would emerge. But as it promises significant investment, what would it actually produce? And who would actually benefit? So this is where it gets a little technical, but we'll breeze through it. In trying to target work to local Crenshaw residents, there were challenges in dealing with state and federal funding. How do you target within these parameters? The Federal Transit Administration required for projects that it funds that jobs be made at a national level. And for state projects in California, you cannot have race or gender-based preferences. So the agreement employs these proxies that are intended to direct work locally and to workers of color and historically marginalized workers in the construction industry. And it makes these different specifications. These are the goals. But for the Crenshaw project, the spirit was to get Crenshaw residents, and particularly Black residents, work on the Crenshaw line. And I just want to point out that this apprenticeship requirement is very important and a very common thing in PLAs. And that this is really important because it gives residents with no experience in the construction industry access to jobs through apprenticeships, but it also addresses this a reason used very frequently called the skills gaps, right? We can't hire locally because workers don't have the skills. So in PLAs, as a general practice, they include skills mechanisms. The goal throughout it is to target work to local disadvantaged workers, and unlike the Atlanta policy, this is a binding agreement leaving Metro, but not the community, with the ability to sue, take legal action, and assess penalties to contractors if the agreement's not met. So from the day it was approved in 2012, the PLA received a lot of publicity as a high-profile success. It's like difficult to actually explain how big these posters are. But I point you to two people that kind of help give you the scale of this. And since you guys aren't familiar with LA, I'll just say this is a major intersection. So the PLA from the very beginning received a lot of publicity as a high-profile success. Even before a single worker was hired, even before the general contractor, the LA was chosen. The LA Times ran stories that touted the local benefits. Metro posted these large billboards at sites which they claimed was to demonstrate that to the community that local workers were hired, but really showcases the agreement as a success. And this worker in particular, Ladea Epps, was highlighted again and again as an example of agreement success. She was a single mother, chronically unemployed, and under the PLA, she gained access to a union job with advancement potential. And as a disadvantaged local apprentice, she met all three of those agreement categories. So she met all of those previously mentioned local targeted worker, disadvantaged worker, and apprentice categories. First Lady Michelle Obama invited her as a special guest for the State of the Union. I mean, huge, right, in 2015. And this really shows how high profile this agreement became. She met with the Secretaries of Labor and Transportation, and again, really highlighted. And this narrative of success dominated the agreement from the beginning. Again, this delivery of paper benefits, right, without knowing who's hired at scale. So this is the Secretary of Labor, then Secretary of Labor touring the project. And you can see Ladea Epps in the background here. Much of the credit is warranted, though this wasn't necessarily true from the beginning. The project has exceeded its outcomes with high diversity numbers. And when apprenticeship numbers were initially lagging due to the workflow, all the stakeholders, including Metro, the contractors, and the community, worked together to improve the worker pipeline process, and the numbers turned around. And I can talk to you more about the challenges and opportunities of this process. But in terms of the agreement outcomes, this was a fairly successful agreement, but it wasn't easy. And even with the significant resources that Metro put into implementation. While the community was pleased when the agreement was approved, it remained vigilant out of fear that benefits wouldn't materialize. And it emerged in this watchdog role, monitored construction sites and worked to improve transparency on the project. Who was being hired, and using these little narrow slats to be able to look to try to see who's actually working on this project. Do we believe the numbers that Metro is putting out? And their goal in undertaking this effort was threefold. First, to raise awareness about the jobs in the community. Secondly, to verify Metro's data. Metro was saying we're meeting these goals, and the community was saying we don't see Black workers on the project. And it's complicated because some of the work is happening underground, so there was disagreements about that process. So they engaged in this strategy to elevate their profile, to show Metro and the community, to show Metro and the contractors that the community is watching, focus on these outcomes. And in a very important move, the community gained access to the job sites. They brought them on to show them who was working, right? And so this process of saying, we're watching you, what's actually happening here, yielded some transparency. And so that's just a really important process in thinking through what are these agreements delivering for whom, and how satisfied are we in general with the outcomes. And so Metro did incorporate community input. They created these reports. The Metro board was really interested in the reports of who they observed seeing on the project. And they did yield these important concessions and transparency. And as a result, everyone agreed that even though this was a pretty adversarial relationship, it was a productive relationship, and the community had important information that improved implementation. And so I want to take a moment to consider this implementation structure, right? Because this is very different than the previous case. Implementation really happened in this way. We have the Metro board, which is comprised of very powerful political leaders, county supervisors who are very powerful in LA. And what they did is they put pressure on Metro, the administrators, to implement the agreement. They made them attend monthly meetings, answer questions, and demonstrate progress. They really championed the PLA, and their pressure, combined with the ability to assess penalties for non-compliance, was a very effective enforcement strategy. Metro implementation staff were hired after PLA approval, and their one job was to implement the agreement. So they had a vested interest in producing outcomes. They, in turn, put pressure on the contractors, who were required to attend monthly Metro board meetings and ensure that they produce hiring targets, since they're the ones with direct control over the hiring outcomes. The contractors worked with the unions to ensure a solid worker pipeline from the union to the job sites and to coordinate to get workers onto the jobs. And this is the community development outcomes were produced through this process. You see that the contractors are the ones that are hiring the workers. This is the community outcome, right? And it's the contractors who have direct influence in this. But throughout, the community played an important role putting pressure on Metro, creating those reports, attending monthly meetings, exercising their political relationships in order to put pressure to keep everyone focused on this question of who gets hired. So even though they didn't directly hire people, they couldn't directly control the community outcomes. They still had influence in this process, and everyone was accountable. And so why does this diagram, that's not even in my book, matter? I think I want to show you that while this agreement has achieved some degree of accountability, everybody cares about this question, the community benefits. But this is a really remarkably fragile process. If any of these pieces changed, the whole accountability structure could fall apart, and it's already changed. Mark Ridley Thomas, who was the champion of the PLA, was termed out, and actually that's a whole other story because he was recently sentenced to prison for bribery charges. And so if there's change on the Metro board, if all of a sudden the contractors don't need another contract, you could see that this accountability structure can fall apart. And throughout, though, the community only has indirect control over getting what they wanted. So what do these agreements produce and for whom? And so for these and my other cases, it's really clear that project owners and developers get what they want from community benefits and project labor agreements, from these benefit sharing agreements. They promote development pretty effectively, and part of this is because these actors get what they want when the agreement gets signed. They get the paper benefits, the project moves forward. And in many ways, local governments can also get what they want really early in the process when the agreement gets signed to facilitate development, but also the appearance of benefits delivery, those paper benefits again. And local governments may also have more control to promote their goals, and so their goals are more assured. Labor unions can also more easily get what they want because they often have direct control over the delivery of their benefits. PLAs, they're a signatory, and these are legally enforceable agreements. And they have legal resources and the expertise and resources to sue if necessary. The problem is that communities are most at risk of not getting what they were promised. Not just paper benefits, but material benefits delivery. And this is because their benefits are often the last to materialize. And they're most contingent on the continued efforts of everyone. And as they lose leverage after the agreements get signed, after the bonds are issued, after the project moves forward, they often have to find these ways to work to keep everyone at the negotiating table focused on creating an agreement structure that, that keeps everyone's eyes on their prize, right? And as we see from the different stories of Atlanta and LA, the organizing tools left to communities during implementations can sometimes be very limited. But again, this is the reason why they came to the process in the beginning. And so what are the takeaways? What did we learn? I hope. Community benefits are often the last to materialize. And as leverage shifts after the agreement gets signed, there's a systematic risk that these agreements don't deliver what they promise to communities. So it becomes really important to ensure accountability. And we can do that in the way that we design these agreements. And even with the exemplar Metro PLA, which reflects in part this vast scale of the agreement, it's still only achieved a very fragile accountability, and this is a very difficult process. And so throughout this equitable and inclusive deliberation that we've really focused on academically is a necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition to ensure benefits, to ensure that jobs materialize. And so rather, implementation benefits from this top-down and bottom-up strategy to ensure accountability to the communities and this material delivery of community benefits. And this means that we need to help communities stay at the table and resource them and provide provisions that ensure their continued leverage and give them these opportunities for recourse. And this includes clawbacks and penalties for noncompliance, which can promote accountability. And we also need to build in the expertise to help all stakeholders deal with what are sometimes the very technical components of these agreements. My book describes these strategies in depth. There's a chapter dedicated to what I think these agreements should look like. So I'm happy to talk about this more. But I want to end by reminding us to think about the bigger picture. Where do community benefits fit into regional equity organizing? And community benefits offer an inherently limited tool in this way. Benefits hinge on urban growth, and they enter into these processes of neighborhood change, which continues to disproportionately favor urban elites, and often these strategies of growth can create gentrification processes that are very difficult to equalize within a bounded agreement. But regardless, it's really important to recognize that these strategies can deliver meaningful benefits to communities. These jobs matter, the parks matter to people's lives, but only if we design them in ways that actually deliver on their promises. And so that is where I wanted to end it now, but I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you for being my first audience. I hope it was okay. Yeah.